The first distant blast rolled across Leipzig like a warning from a collapsing world, and then the second came, closer, sharper, scattering glass from a tram station whose roof had already been blackened by days of fighting. Dust drifted through the cracked beams like pale smoke, settling over 3 German women trapped beneath the fractured structure, their breaths shallow, their bodies pressed under cold metal that had once carried workers across the city. April 17, 1945, was not a day Leipzig would forget easily, yet in the cramped hollow of the wrecked station, memory had no meaning, only survival did. Outside, American artillery thundered as the 69th Infantry Division advanced through the outskirts, pushing toward the city center with a pace that surprised even their commanders. The Germans were disintegrating. Volkssturm formations of elderly men and boys, scattered Wehrmacht pockets, desperate civilians hoping for the end. But inside the ruined tram station, time felt frozen, held in place by pain and silence. The youngest woman, barely in her 20s, let out a trembling gasp as another tremor shook the shattered roof above her. Not far from the structure, a squad of American medics moved with rigid efficiency. They had been running triage since dawn, drifting between aid stations and firing lines, guided by the principle in every field manual. Wounded first, then questions. Sergeant Cole, his uniform stained with dried mud and faint streaks of blood, paused when the next artillery ripple sounded oddly muffled. He tilted his head, listening for something human. There it was, a thin, fragile cry, carried on the echo. Cole raised his hand, halting the group. "You hear that?" he asked quietly. One medic shrugged, another frowned. The city produced 1,000 strange sounds in war, and most were ones men learned to ignore. But Cole stepped toward the tram station, his boots crunching over broken stone. The smell of burned insulation mixed with the damp scent of concrete, and somewhere within the shadows of the collapsed roof, the cry came again. He motioned the others forward. Every soldier knew the risk. German troops sometimes hid in rubble to strike at passing units. A cornered sniper could bring ruin in seconds. But the medics advanced anyway, driven by that stubborn duty repeated until it became instinctual. Find the wounded, stabilize, evacuate. The Geneva Convention required it, but conscience demanded it louder. As they neared the wreckage, another sound emerged, a faint tapping, weak and uneven, as if someone struck metal with trembling fingers. Corporal Heinz crouched and pressed his ear to a slab of concrete. "There's at least 2 under there," he murmured. Cole nodded, already reaching for his entrenching tool. The others followed without discussion. War had taught them that hesitation cost lives. Inside the darkness, the trapped women heard the scraping of tools and low English voices. Fear swept through them. Propaganda had warned that Americans would show no mercy, that they would kill civilians without hesitation. Yet the tone of these voices held no fury, only urgency. The oldest woman whispered a prayer, uncertain whether she wished for rescue or the end. The medics worked methodically, prying apart twisted beams and shifting chunks of debris, each movement sending small avalanches of dust into the air. Sweat mixed with grime on their foreheads. A misjudged lift could cause the entire structure to collapse, but they pressed on. Cole could hear breathing now, shallow, strained, but alive. When the first gap opened wide enough, a thin hand emerged. Cole grasped it gently. "You're coming with me," he said, not as reassurance, but as an order meant to cut through fear and pain. The young woman stared up at him, eyes wide with disbelief, tears carving clean lines through the dust. Her expectation of cruelty dissolved, replaced by confusion almost as overwhelming as her injury. Another rumble shook the ground, and fragments of the roof groaned overhead. "We've got to move fast," Heinz warned. They worked with renewed urgency, sliding supports under unstable beams, widening the opening, and lifting the second woman free. She cried out as her crushed leg shifted, and Cole quickly pressed a field dressing to the bleeding wound. The third woman was deeper under the rubble, her breath ragged, her eyes half open. Heinz hesitated. The beam pinning her was too heavy for safe removal. "If we lift that wrong, it'll bring the whole thing down," he whispered. Cole looked at the trembling structure, then at the woman struggling to breathe. The decision was instant. "We lift." All four men braced themselves and heaved. Muscles strained, grit bit into palms, and for a moment the beam refused to budge. Then, with a groan, it rose just enough for Cole to pull the woman free. The roof shuddered, dropping splinters onto their backs, but held. They carried the three women out into pale daylight where smoke drifted across the street in thin ribbons. The women blinked at the brightness, disoriented, shaking, whispering soft apologies as if their suffering were an inconvenience. Cole offered a tired, wry smile. "You're fine. We've had worse mornings." But before they could reach the road, a single rifle crack split the air. A bullet clipped the corner of a broken wall beside them, sending shards flying. Somewhere nearby, a German defender still fought on, desperate and unseen. Cole ducked instinctively. The medics froze, hearts pounding as they tightened their grip on the stretchers, aware that one wrong step could turn rescue into tragedy. The tram station groaned behind them, dust drifting from its fractured roof. Cole glanced back once, then forward into the maze of ruined street. The women trembled on the stretchers, caught between terror and hope, their breaths quick and uneven as the world around them narrowed to noise and dust. And then, from across the intersection, another sound echoed through the smoke, one that would force the medics to choose between sheltering in place or pressing forward into danger, a sound that promised either salvation or disaster. The rifle shot faded into the fractured echoes of the dying city, and for a long moment the medics remained crouched, their breath curling in thin clouds as dust drifted around them. The three injured women stared upward with wide, frightened eyes, their bodies trembling on the stretchers as though bracing for another impact. But no second shot followed. Only the distant rumble of collapsing masonry and the rhythmic thud of American artillery rolling deeper into Leipzig filled the air. Cole swallowed his nerves and raised his hand, signaling the others to move. They stepped carefully, navigating the rubble-strewn street with the focus of men who knew each footfall mattered. War had stripped the city to sharp angles and shadows, and every broken window or half-standing wall felt like a pair of unseen eyes. A hidden German soldier could turn the scene into chaos with a single squeeze of a trigger. But the medic's priority remained unchanged. The wounded came first. That rule had no nationality. It didn't matter that these were German women, civilians Hitler's collapsing Reich had failed to protect. The American field manuals, the Geneva Convention, and an unspoken moral code insisted that the injured must be treated with dignity. Cole had repeated that principle often enough that it had become the steady voice in his mind. Still, he couldn't ignore the fact that they were in a city clinging to the last threads of its defense. Leipzig streets were filled with stories of survival and surrender, but also of fanatic pockets that refused to lay down arms. Volkssturm units, gray-bearded men and boys barely old enough to shave, had been spotted throughout the morning, clutching rifles too heavy for their shoulders. They fought without hope, driven by fear more than ideology, and unpredictability made them dangerous. The medics reached a shallow depression beside a crumbled bakery, pausing long enough to check the women's wounds. The youngest had shrapnel lodged near her ribcage, each breath a tremor. The second struggled to keep consciousness, her crushed leg pressed into a makeshift splint. The third, older than the rest, coughed repeatedly, her lungs filled with dust. Her gaze wandered between the medics' faces, as if searching for a reminder that they were not her enemy. Heinz knelt beside her and offered a sip from his canteen, speaking softly in the clumsy German he had picked up from a Pennsylvania grandmother who would have fainted at the sight of him now. "Keine Angst," he murmured. "We're helfen." His accent butchered every syllable, but the woman managed a faint, incredulous smile. Cracks of distant gunfire rattled across the rooftop. Cole scanned the intersection ahead, noting the charred shell of a tram lying on its side, wheels still faintly warm from the morning's barrage. There was movement near the far corner, a flicker of shadow that didn't match the rhythm of smoke. He felt a twinge of unease, but turning back wasn't an option. The women's chances of surviving depended on getting them to the forward aid station. He signaled the group to lift. Each man moved with practiced coordination, balancing urgency with steady control, the stretchers rising smoothly despite the rough terrain. As they advanced, the city around them revealed the toll of war. Leipzig had suffered more than 90,000 civilian casualties during the final months of the conflict. People still wandered the streets searching for relatives, carrying makeshift white flags in hopes of avoiding misinterpretation. The Americans had been instructed repeatedly to minimize civilian deaths, an order that stood in sharp contrast to the chaos Germans had been warned to expect from the invading forces. The women on the stretchers had likely grown up hearing that Allied soldiers would be merciless, that surrender meant suffering. Yet here they were, being carried with a gentleness that felt almost impossible in a city where nothing gentle remained. A tremor of pain crossed the youngest woman's face as the group navigated a broken curb. She whispered something faint and hesitant. Cole leaned closer. "What is it?" She struggled for breath. Why help us?" The question lingered in the street like an accusation, a challenge to the logic of hatred that war had stitched into both sides. Cole didn't break stride. "Because you're hurt," he answered simply. "That's all that matters right now." The woman blinked, processing the impossibility of compassion from the hands she had been taught to fear. Sometimes the simplest truths carried the greatest weight. A low whistle cut across the air, followed by another artillery rumble. The medics hurried forward, rounding a corner where the outline of an American half-track peeked from behind a collapsed wall. Relief flickered across their faces. They were close, but the sense of safety was fragile. A sudden cough erupted from the second woman, violent and raw. She grabbed at Cole's sleeve, her fingers cold. He immediately knelt, pressing 2 fingers against her neck. The pulse fluttered weakly. "We need to move faster," he muttered. Sweat trickled into his eyes. His hands smelled of metal and antiseptic, the sense of decisions made under pressure. Heinz scanned the rooftops again. "Something's wrong," he whispered. "Feels too quiet." Cole agreed. Leipzig's final defense had been unpredictable all morning. A sniper could be lying between chimneys, waiting for a target. But the risk of stopping outweighed the danger of moving. They lifted again, quickening their pace, boots crunching through plaster and soot. The air thickened with the faint scent of gasoline from a ruptured tram line. Across the street, the windows of a textile factory hung shattered like jagged teeth, fluttering with strips of cloth that swayed as if beckoning. Halfway down the block, the sound returned, the same muffled echo they had heard before discovering the women. It wasn't gunfire or shelling. It was something human, but distorted by distance. A groan? A warning? A call? Cole couldn't decipher it, but the direction was unmistakable. It came from behind the factory wall, close enough that any hidden soldier could be watching their every step. He considered diverting around the next alley, but that would cost precious minutes. The second woman's breathing had turned ragged. Her grip on consciousness seemed to slip with each tremor of the stretcher. The medics pressed onward, determined to reach the half-track just 50 yards ahead. The women lay in stark contrast to the broken city, fragile, battered, yet undeniably alive. Every breath they drew felt like a small victory. Then, just as they crossed the midpoint of the street, a new sound emerged from the factory's shadowed corridor. Not a gunshot, not an explosion. Something far more unsettling. A deep, strained voice speaking German, close enough that Cole could distinguish every word, and the tone carried neither threat nor surrender, but a desperate, urgent plea that would force the medics to stop in their tracks. The voice coming from the factory's shadowed corridor stopped the medics mid-stride, its tone rough and strained, as if dragged from a throat coated in dust. Cole raised a clenched fist, signaling an immediate halt. The women on the stretchers whimpered at the sudden stillness. The absence of movement made every pain sharper, every breath more conscious. Heinz shifted his grip on the forward stretcher, eyes locked on the corridor's darkness. No one dared move. In cities at the edge of collapse, a voice could mean anything: a dying soldier, a desperate civilian, or someone pretending to be either. Cole took one cautious step forward. The voice repeated itself, weaker now. Bit wartet, ich bin verletzt. The plea was unmistakable, someone begging them to wait, claiming to be injured. Cole exchanged a look with the others. The medics were trained to prioritize the wounded, but they also knew deception could be fatal. Every ruined building had corners where dying battalions hid behind last strands of duty or delusion. But the voice held no anger. It wavered, cracked, swallowed itself between syllables. It was not the voice of a man setting a trap. It was the voice of someone hovering close to death. Cole motioned for Hines to stay with the women and took Alvarez with him, edging toward the corridor with weapons lowered but ready. The corridor smelled of damp cloth and powdered concrete. A faint beam of afternoon light filtered through holes in the roof, catching drifting particles like tiny sparks. At the far end, collapsed shelving and sacks of textile scraps created a haphazard barrier. Behind it, they found the source. A German soldier in his late 30s, uniform torn, leg twisted unnaturally beneath a fallen timber. His rifle lay out of reach, and his left hand pressed against a wound near his abdomen. He blinked at the Americans with a dazed mixture of fear and relief. Alvarez immediately leaned down, medical instinct overriding caution. Cole scanned the shadows, ensuring no one else hid nearby. When satisfied, he called out to the others. "He's not a threat. We can move him." Hines protested from the street. "Cole, we can't take on more. Those women are slipping." Cole knew he was right. Their primary mission was to get the civilians to safety. But leaving the man behind to bleed out felt like something the war had demanded too many times already. He knelt beside the German. "We can't take you with us, but we won't leave you dying alone." The man stared at him with pale, exhausted eyes. "Ich verstehe," he whispered. They applied a field dressing to his abdomen and splinted his leg, stabilizing him enough that he might hold on until the next sweep. As they prepared to leave, the soldier reached for Cole's sleeve. "Please, the women, bring them out." His lips trembled. "They worked in the factory. They brought bread to us when we guarded the yard. Good people." The world outside was burning, yet even here someone remembered an act of kindness. Cole squeezed the man's shoulder once, then returned to the street. The women lay where they had been left, their breathing uneven. The youngest looked between the medics, confused. "A soldier?" she whispered. Cole nodded. "He wanted to make sure you got out." Something flickered across her expression. Shock, sadness, recognition of a humanity that had survived even under the banners of armies. But there was no time to linger. The second woman, the one with the crushed leg, convulsed suddenly, a sharp inhale rattling in her chest. Hines knelt beside her, checking her pulse with trembling fingers. "We're running out of minutes," he muttered. They lifted again. As they moved, the street ahead erupted in a new scatter of gunfire. American troops several blocks north were clearing a row of warehouses, and the firefight sent ricochets skipping across the rooftops like metallic insects. The medics instinctively hunched over the stretchers, shielding the women as best they could. A shard of brick clipped Alvarez's canteen, puncturing it and spilling the water in a thin silver arc. He swore softly but kept moving. Smoke drifted in thicker waves now, making it harder to breathe, harder to see. A tram wire overhead sparked intermittently, dangling like a dying serpent. The third woman coughed violently, choking on the dust. Hines tilted her upward slightly, helping her breathe. "Hold on," he murmured. "We're close." But even he could feel the weight of time pressing against them. Every second lost to detours, every hesitation at a shadow, cut into the narrow window the women had left. They pushed forward until at last the outline of the American half-track sharpened through the haze. A medic with a red armband stood atop it, waving them closer. Relief surged through the group, but a sudden blast from behind threw them off balance. A mortar round had landed somewhere in the next street over, sending a wave of dust rushing toward them. The shock wave rattled the factory windows. Cole nearly lost his grip as the youngest woman cried out, terror erupting from her chest. Hines steadied the stretcher, coughing through the haze. "Move!" Cole barked, and they sprinted the final meters, every step a battle against exhaustion and fear. When they reached the vehicle, the half-track crew helped lift the women aboard with practiced precision. The interior smelled of disinfectant and motor oil. The crew chief examined the women quickly. "They're bad," he said quietly. "We'll get them to the aid station, but we need to go now." Cole nodded, then turned back to his team. Their faces were streaked with soot, eyes red from the smoke. Before they could climb aboard, the youngest woman reached for Cole's arm. Her fingers trembled, nails darkened with dirt. "Danke," she whispered. Even if I don't make it." Cole shook his head gently. "You're making it." His tone offered no room for argument. He closed her hand around a folded bandage packet, a small gesture, but one meant to remind her she was not abandoned. The half-track's engine roared, ready to peel away toward the division's forward aid station. But another sound rose behind them, a deep groaning crash as part of the factory roof collapsed from the earlier mortar tremor. A billow of debris surged into the street. Cole watched the cloud rise and felt a harsh twist in his chest. The wounded German soldier they had left inside would not survive a collapse like that. For a moment the world narrowed to a single, choking realization: they had saved who they could, but war had stolen the rest. The crew chief shouted at them to climb aboard, but Cole hesitated, staring into the thickening dust as if expecting a miracle to emerge from the rubble. Hines grasped his shoulder firmly. "Cole, we did everything possible. We have to go." Cole finally nodded and climbed onto the half-track. The vehicle lurched forward, treads grinding over broken stone. As they sped away, the women lying inside clung to consciousness, their expressions carved from exhaustion, fear, and a fragile, growing trust. Outside, Leipzig burned in streaks of orange and gray, the city's final agony unfolding in the distance. The medics didn't know what awaited them ahead, whether the aid station still stood, whether more fighting blocked the route, but they had no choice except to move forward. Then, just as the vehicle rounded a ruined corner, a voice crackled through the half-track's radio, urgent, breathless, a message that would change their understanding of the road ahead. It wasn't about enemy troops or artillery. It was about something waiting at the aid station, something unexpected, something that would challenge everything they believed about what the end of a war should look like. The radio crackled again, its distorted voice struggling against static as the half-track barreled through Leipzig's fractured street. Cole leaned closer, trying to decipher the message over the roar of the engine and the rumble of distant explosions. Aid station, overflow, new arrivals, civilians, critical condition, prepare for triage on approach. The last words cut through clearly: be ready. Situation unstable. Alvarez exchanged a glance with Hines, the kind worn by soldiers who knew that even rescue, the rare quiet sanctuary of war, had limits. The three German women lay inside, pale and trembling, their breaths shallow but steady. Cole felt the weight of responsibility tighten across his ribs. They had crossed streets choked with fire, pulled these women out from under collapsing beams, shielded them through gunfire, and yet the final stretch threatened to be the hardest. As the half-track approached the forward aid station, the scale of the crisis became visible. The courtyard overflowed with wounded, German civilians, American soldiers, even a few dazed Volkssturm youths who had been swept into a war they never understood. White sheets hung between beams like makeshift partitions. Medics moved in hurried lines, their hands stained, their faces hollowed by fatigue. A pile of shattered stretchers leaned against a wall like remnants of a storm. The station had once been a schoolhouse. Childish murals of animals still decorated the bricks, now flecked with soot and dried blood. The juxtaposition felt cruel, almost mocking. the innocence of what the building once represented clashing with the brutal necessity it now served. The half-track lurched to a stop, and the crew chief swung open the rear door. "We unload now," he shouted. Cole and his team lifted the first woman gently, though not gently enough. She cried out as her wounded leg shifted. A nearby medic rushed forward, directing them to a narrow space beneath an overhang. "Set her there," he said, his voice steady but eyes darting to the growing line of stretchers behind them. "We'll get a surgeon as soon as we can." The promise felt thin, stretched like everything else in this place. The second woman convulsed again as they lowered her onto a cot. The dust she had inhaled had settled deep into her lungs. Cole held her hand until her breathing steadied, barely. The third woman, coughing but conscious, met his eyes with an expression that mixed gratitude and disbelief, as if she were still waiting to wake from a nightmare where enemies became her only hope. The medics worked swiftly, but not without a quiet tenderness. They cleaned wounds, checked pulses, whispered reassurances that transcended language. Humanity had a way of surviving even where buildings couldn't. Inside the station, the air pulsed with tension. A surgeon hurried past them, barking orders. "Prepare the south room for emergency." He nodded. "You're safe here. We'll take care of you." She closed her eyes, as if allowing herself, for the first time, to trust that the ground beneath her wasn't about to collapse. Outside, the sky dimmed with a drifting gray haze, sun filtered through smoke like a fading lantern. Leipzig's fall was inevitable, only days away. But for Cole and his team, victory wasn't measured in miles gained or flags raised. It was measured in breaths preserved, in the fragile pulse of life responding to care rather than violence. The ethics of war mattered most in moments like this, when the world seemed determined to forget them. Alvarez knelt beside the second woman, adjusting her bandages. "She needs surgery soon," he whispered. "If they can't get to her," his voice trailed off. Cole rested a hand on his shoulder. "They will," he said, even if he wasn't sure. War demanded faith. Not blind, but stubborn, resilient, the kind that pushed men forward even when logic urged surrender. A commotion stirred inside the schoolhouse. A nurse rushed out, calling for Cole. "You carried in the older woman?" she asked breathlessly. Cole nodded. "She's asking for you." He followed her through the narrow hallway where cots lined the walls, the moans of the wounded creating a low, mournful chorus. When he reached the third woman's cot, she opened her eyes slowly. Her voice was soft but clear enough. "The man in the factory," she whispered. "Did he survive?" The question cut through Cole like a blade. He knelt, lowering his head. "Surgery. And we need more plasma, anything we have left." Behind him, a nurse guided a crying child toward a safer corner, her arms wrapped protectively around the small, soot-stained body. The chaos had a rhythm, a momentum powered not by panic but by necessity. Cole watched for a moment, struck by how war forced strangers into bonds forged not by ideology but by survival. As the first woman was carried inside for evaluation, Cole exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. But the respite was brief. A second radio message burst across the courtyard, clearer this time. "Be advised. Enemy resistance collapsing in central Leipzig. Expect surge of wounded civilians. Repeat, surge inbound." The words rippled through the medics like a cold wind. More wounded meant more strain on dwindling supplies, more impossible choices between who could be saved and who could not. It was the cruel arithmetic of war, and no amount of training eased the burden it placed on those who had to make the decisions. Heinz rubbed his face with a trembling hand. "We barely have room now," he muttered. "How are we supposed to handle more?" Cole didn't answer. He looked toward the three women they had rescued. Their ordeal had pushed the team to the edge, but he refused to believe their efforts would end in vain. War often robbed people of the chance to finish what they started. He wasn't ready to accept that here. The youngest woman blinked up at him, her voice a rasping whisper. "Are we safe now?" Cole hesitated. Safety was a relative concept in a city still shaking with artillery. But we did what we could. Her expression fell, but she didn't cry. Instead, she reached weakly for his hand. Thank you for trying. The simple sincerity in her voice felt heavier than the city's rubble. Before Cole could respond, another medic hurried in, urgency etched across his face. Sergeant, we've got a situation outside. You need to see this. Now. Cole rose, exchanging a final, reassuring glance with the women. Then he followed the medic out into the fading light, footsteps quickening as shouts grew louder in the courtyard. When he stepped outside, he froze. A new column of figures was approaching the aid station, limping, dust-covered, hands raised. Not soldiers. Not civilians. Something far more complicated and unexpected, their arrival carrying consequences the medics could never have prepared for. That's it for today's story. And before you go, please tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories reach. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.